The composition of cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, is usually studied by draining the fluid after the lumbar puncture. Which of the following areas is the primary target for this procedure? So let's just break down this question. So cerebrospinal fluid, this is the fluid that is flowing between the spinal cord, and it's also in the brain to help nourish the brain, and it's necessary to have. And sometimes we need to study it, such as in this case with a lumbar puncture. This is a procedure to obtain cerebrospinal fluid because we want to see how the brain is functioning. And certain diseases such as meningitis, which is inflammation of these meninges that we're talking about, the layers that protect the brain, if we have an infection with that, then the cerebrospinal fluid will look very cloudy, and this could give indication as to what's going on. So sometimes it's important to check this cerebrospinal fluid, and the lumbar puncture would be the procedure done in order to check it. Now, this question is asking for the landmark of where the lumbar puncture should go. Not necessarily the location of where it should go on the spine, because we're saying lumbar puncture, but as far as how deep that needle should go. So the reason we want to know how deep it should go is because we want to reach the spinal fluid itself. So as you can see, there's multiple layers here. And if you go too shallow, then you wouldn't actually reach the fluid that you need to test for. And if you go too deep, then you would either miss the fluid or you could cause injury because you're going too deep. So you want to know that actual point to obtain the cerebrospinal fluid from. Now, in this diagram where it has the layers of the meninges which line the brain and separate between the skull and the brain for protection and have different purposes, these are also used for the spinal cord themselves. So these layers that we see in this diagram are the same layers that we're looking at when we look at the spinal cord in terms of how deep to go. So even though you see the brain here, just of note, if it was of the spinal cord, which is where the procedure is, in the lumbar puncture, it would be the same layers that we're referring to. So the layers that we are referring to here, we have the dura mater. So you have dura, that's pointing here. So these are just the different layers. You have the arachnoid. So arachnoid, which is right here. And then you have the pia mater. Pia is here. And as you can see, there's different lengths. They have different roles that they would have based on the thickness, where it's located, what kind of material it is. So the dura mater is the outermost layer, and it is a tough outer layer, so it'd be thick because it's closest to the skull, and we want to protect. Our brain is so precious inside. We don't want to have a thin skull or a thin dura mater. We want to have some oomph before we get to it because we want to protect the brain. The brain is everything to us, right? Then after that would be the arachnoid layer, which is that middle layer, and it's also known as a web-like layer. And then you have your pia mater, which is the innermost layer, which is thin, it's delicate layer, and it's directly on the surface of the brain itself and on the spinal cord. So both the brain and the spinal cord, it's going directly onto it. So in order to answer this question of knowing where this lumbar puncture, how deep it should go to get to the cerebrospinal fluid, we want to understand where is the cerebrospinal fluid actually located in the midst of all of these layers. So it would be found in the subarachnoid space, and this is the area that's between the arachnoid and the pia mater. So sub, below arachnoid. So subarachnoid space would be between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. So looking at our diagram, the area between the two, it would be sort of like there. And this makes sense, right? Because the arachnoid is the middle, it's like a web-like layer. So these are more of your thin, more delicate layers. So it would have the space between these thin layers to have the cerebrospinal fluid. Unlike something like the dura mater, which is tough outer layer, you wouldn't really be able to have any fluid in a space if it's very thick and tough. Okay, so now we know that it's between the arachnoid and the pia mater, and it's the subarachnoid space. And therefore, if it is between that arachnoid mater and that pia mater, then this is the area of landmark that we would want to go in order to obtain the cerebrospinal fluid for the lumbar puncture.